This is why you need a security system for your house. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside of the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, but it didn't bother me. I got home from work one evening in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up, I only saw what my headlights and porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd as I had never smelled that before around my house, but I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just gotten off a shift with a few hours of overtime and I was exhausted. It wasn't even 7 yet, but I decided to call it an early night. I woke up sometime later when I heard a noise inside of my house. I wasn't immediately worried because my best friend had a spare key and would sometimes come over. However, he'd always text me and let me know, but when I checked my phone, there were no messages. I called out my friend's name. There were a few seconds of silence before I heard someone stomping as they ran through the bottom floor. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I opened the door and stepped inside. I was terrified. That's when I heard them thunder down my hallway. Part 2, why you need a security system for your house. The house had 2 bedrooms on either hallway and a bathroom. The bedroom doors were closed, but the bathroom door was creaked open. I was so lucky in that moment because he sprinted to the bathroom. That gave me just enough time to open the attic access in my closet and pull myself up. As I lifted myself, I heard the person run towards my room. I had just pulled my feet inside when my bedroom door burst open. He walked in and stopped. When he didn't see me, he went and checked the other room, then came back and turned on the light. A moment later, he ripped open my closet door. After a few seconds, he stepped away and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. Then he went downstairs. I had left my phone when I ran for the closet and wasn't sure I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I counted to 1,000, then climbed down to call the police. My bed had been flipped, furniture knocked over, and all my things destroyed. The only thing missing was a knife from my kitchen. The police found that the side door had been forced open by a crowbar. They also found cigarette butts and an empty tube used for drugs. They think he had been watching the house for a while. I installed some security on the house after this. I can't imagine what would have happened if he had come to my room first. Storytime about how I had to get a restraining order against my creepy neighbor. I found a good deal on a rental and moved into a new neighborhood. It seemed like a decent area and I was excited for a fresh start. My friend was helping me move my stuff into my new house when my neighbor noticed and came over to welcome me. He seemed nice, and he even offered to help us unload the heavy furniture, which I accepted. A couple nights later, someone rang my doorbell and it was him. He brought me a plate of cookies and welcomed me to the neighborhood again. I thought he was just friendly and trying to be nice, but he kept doing things for me. Whenever he mowed his lawn, he would come over and mow mine as well without asking. I told him he didn't have to do that, but he insisted and said it wasn't any trouble. He brought me over food every few nights and always said he made extra and wanted to share. I wanted him to stop, so I told him that I was going on a strict diet and politely declined the next time he tried it. At this point, I could tell he was being overly friendly and it started getting weird. One morning, I came outside and he was washing my car. I asked him what he was doing and he replied that he just finished washing his and figured he'd do mine as well. I told him I appreciate it, but I didn't want my car washed and he shouldn't have done it without my permission. Unfortunately, things kept getting weirder from here. Part 2, why I had to get a restraining order against my creepy neighbor. My new neighbor kept doing unwanted favors for me. Whenever I asked him to stop, he would just ignore me and do it anyway. It got creepy when I got a package in the mail that I didn't order. It was a new keyboard that I was talking about getting myself for Christmas in my live stream on Twitch a few nights prior. No one on my Twitch stream had my address. Upon further inspection, there was a note inside the box that said, "Here's that new keyboard you were talking about, from your neighbor Jim." I never told Jim about my Twitch account, and I had no clue he watched it, which led me to believe he'd been looking me up online. I was super creeped out at this point and was going to tell him to leave me alone for good the next time I saw him. The last straw was when I came home from work and this man was hanging up Christmas lights on my house for the holidays. I was shocked. I got out of the car and immediately went off on him. I threatened to call the police and get a restraining order on him if he didn't leave me alone. Apparently, he didn't get the message because he sent me flowers with an apology card the next day and tried to contact me on 3 social media platforms. I contacted the police when he wouldn't stop and filed for a civil harassment restraining order. After this, Jim stopped, but I still ended up moving a couple months later to get away from him. Crime Fanatic Friday, the Tylenol murders of 1982. On the morning of September 29th, 1982, a young 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman had a sore throat and a runny nose. She told her parents of her symptoms, who then gave her 1 extra strength Tylenol capsule. They had no clue that the capsule was laced with potassium cyanide, which is highly poisonous. By 7 a.m. the next morning, Mary was dead. That same day, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus died of what was initially thought to be a massive heart attack. However, this also turned out to be cyanide poisoning. His brother and sister-in-law both took Tylenol capsules from the same bottle Adam used earlier that day. They also died within a couple days. Over the next few days, 3 more strange deaths occurred in Chicago and Illinois. They all had one thing in common. They took Tylenol shortly before they died. In October, investigators made a connection between the poisonings and Tylenol. The gelatin-based capsules were popular because they were slick and easy to swallow, but this also made them easy to be tampered with. The manufacturers of Tylenol immediately took to the media, issuing mass warnings and recalling more than 31 million bottles. As time passed, the case continued to confuse police, the drug manufacturer, and the public. Crime Fanatic Friday, Part 2, The Tylenol Murders of 1982. The manufacturers of Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson, put out a reward for anyone with information about these random murders. Tainted capsules were discovered in early October in stores, but luckily they hadn't been sold or consumed. The police gathered that someone had taken bottles off of the shelves of their local stores, laced them with poison, and then returned them to the shelves to be purchased by unknowing victims. Unfortunately, the perpetrators of these murders have never been found. Before this crisis, Tylenol controlled over 35% of the pain reliever market. Within a few weeks of the murders, it dropped to 8%. Johnson & Johnson developed a new tablet that was just coated in that slick gelatin. They also introduced a tamper-proof packaging that made it obvious if they had been opened. They invested $100 million, which in a year rebounded sales and secured their spot for the nation's favorite pain reliever. In 1983, Congress passed the Tylenol bill, which made it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products. Other manufacturers also made products that were tamper-proof after this disaster. The tragedies that occurred can never be reversed, but they inspired a series of moves that made over-the-counter medications safer. Storytime about how I found out my boyfriend was married. I had just moved to a new state and decided to download Bumble to meet new people. One day, I matched with this great guy named Alex. He had a good job, his own house, never married, and no kids. We lived in the same town and we started spending a lot of time together. However, I noticed that Alex started doing some weird things. He started coming over unannounced. Before he left, he would always check to make sure that the doors and windows were locked, and when I wasn't with him, he was always blowing up my phone constantly asking what I was doing. A few months into our relationship, he introduced me to his family and I introduced him to mine. It also turned out that we had a ton of mutual friends. He knew my new best friend Laura and her husband from the gym. When we made the connection, he made it clear that he didn't want me being friends with her anymore. Anytime I would bring her up in conversation, he would get agitated. Laura and I were both teachers at the same school. One afternoon, she came storming into my classroom. She told me that she had just had a girls' night with the girls from the gym. They were all showing pictures of their wedding since one of the girls recently got engaged. That's when she noticed that my boyfriend was in pictures with another woman. It turns out he was the husband of one of the girls that she was having dinner with. Part 2 of how I found out my boyfriend was married. When my best friend showed me the pictures of my boyfriend and his wife, I was livid. I saw red and immediately texted him telling him to come over to my house to talk. He ended up calling me on the way home from work but refused to come over to my house until I told him what I wanted to talk about. When I told him, he automatically started blaming my best friend and her husband for telling his business, saying it wasn't theirs to tell. I felt so angry and betrayed, but most of all, I felt stupid for not knowing. I told him it was over and that I was done with him. I didn't hear from him again after that. He moved away and no one at the gym had seen him either. A few months after everything happened, his wife posted on Facebook saying that she was getting a divorce. It turns out that he had beaten her up so badly that she ended up in the hospital. This abuse had apparently been going on for months. I felt that it was a blessing in disguise that I had gotten out of that relationship. Seeing how controlling he was within just a few months of dating, who knows what would have happened if I didn't find out and kept dating him. Luckily, I haven't seen or heard of him since 2018 and I hope that I never do. Storytime about how I had to choose between my family and the love of my life. I come from a pretty well-off family. Growing up, I never had to worry about anything because it was always taken care of by my parents. They were pretty religious and we would attend church every week. From a young age, I knew that I was attracted to girls. I also knew that my parents wouldn't accept it, so I buried my feelings deep. Luckily, I was never tempted because I never met anyone that I had feelings for. Fast forward to my senior year of high school. I was on the volleyball team and a new girl named Juliet had transferred to our school and joined the team. We quickly became friends, but there was always a lingering connection between us. I had easily developed a crush on her, but I knew that I couldn't act on it. During spring break, we went to a party and liquid courage led me to confessing my feelings for her. When I told her everything, she kissed me and I felt butterflies fluttering in my stomach. We secretly started dating after this and only my older sister and best friend knew about it. However, the more time I spent with Juliet, the more I knew that she was the one. One night, I finally built up the courage to tell my parents. Unfortunately, the reaction was worse than I expected. They yelled, cried, and told me they'd never accept it. Then they told me they would cut me off and kick me out if I kept seeing her. I was scared and didn't know what to do. Part 2 of how I had to choose between my family and the love of my life. After my parents gave me the ultimatum, I was terrified. The next day after school, I met up with Juliet with the intention of breaking things off. When I told her what happened, she comforted me and told me that it was okay. She said she understood it was an impossible choice and wouldn't blame me for choosing my family. She just wanted me to be happy and do what was best for me. Juliet loved me enough to let me go, even though I knew it was killing her. This was the deciding factor for me. As much as my parents loved me, they didn't accept me for who I am, but Juliet always had. While my parents were at work, we went to my house and packed my things. I called my older sister and she took me in with open arms. I cried to her for a while because I knew that I would never speak to my parents again. A few years later, my sister was getting married and she wanted me to be her maid of honor. Juliet and I were still together and happier than ever. I knew that my family was going to be at the wedding, but I didn't care what they thought anymore. I walked in hand with Juliet and saw my parents' face drop at our entrance. The rest of the family made eyes as well, but we ignored them and enjoyed our night. A year later, I proposed to Juliet and she said yes. Even though I lost my parents, I don't regret my decision. Eventually, we'll make our own family. This is how I found out my childhood best friend was a ghost. I grew up with a girl named Katie Wells. I lived on a farm, and Katie lived with an old woman named Irene in the next house over. Katie and Irene weren't related, but whenever I asked Katie about her, she would just change the subject. It seemed like they never got along because they never talked to each other. Katie seemed really sheltered, and I thought it was because Irene wouldn't let her do much. Whenever I would talk about boys, or a new celebrity crush I had, or even a new popular TV show, she never knew what I was referring to. A while later, my mom ended up quitting her job and working from home, so she didn't take me to Katie's house to have Irene watch me anymore. I remember wanting to go over to see Katie, and I asked my mom a few times, but she always said no. I eventually made new friends, and me and Katie grew apart. A couple years went by, and I started to realize I never saw Katie around anymore. She used to talk about her dad Pat a lot, so I assumed she went to live with him. I saw Irene outside one day, and I asked her how Katie was doing and where she'd been. However, she just looked at me like I was crazy. She told me that she had no idea who Katie was and that no one has ever lived with her. I told Irene about how we used to play together at her house, and she gave me a weird look and asked me if I was feeling okay. This is when things got strange. Part 2 of how I found out my childhood best friend was a ghost. The more details I told Irene about Katie, the more she looked at me like I was mental. She assured me it was just me and her in the house when my mom would drop me off. I was shocked. I went home and asked my mom about Katie, and she gave me the same confused look Irene just gave me and told me she didn't know what I was talking about. I couldn't believe it. How was I the only one who remembered her? I was starting to think I was going insane. It even crossed my mind that maybe Katie was an imaginary friend that I made up when I was little. However, I vividly remember playing with her every time I went over. I thought about it for days and I couldn't get it out of my head. The mystery kept me up at night, and I even dreamt about my old childhood friend. I decided to do some research on Irene's house, and my heart sank to my stomach when I realized what happened. I discovered the first person to ever own the house was a man named Patrick Wells back in 1941. I tried to find anything I could on Katie, but nothing came up. I remember Katie talking about her dad Pat when I was younger. It finally made sense how she never knew about any recent events I would bring up and why her and Irene would never communicate. I realized that I was the only one who saw Katie because she wasn't alive. I had been playing with a spirit all that time growing up.